Everybody shut up. We're recording. Shh. This is where the DJ talks. Right. Oh. Okay. So we're going to talk about, make sure my screens actually pick this up. We're going to talk about how to run an amateur radio net. Now, I know everybody in the room has run a net. Okay. I don't know, David, on the Zoom if you have, but we're recording this for posterity. So someone may get something out of this. And if anybody has comments and they want to talk about experiences or whatnot, feel free to jump in with your comments because I will repeat them for the recording, but I obviously don't know everything and I would be happy to take additional comments from other people. So, but we're going to talk about running an amateur radio net. So what is a net? A net is an on-air meeting of 2 or more amateur radio operators. So, you say 2 operators. Well, isn't that just a QSO? Well, a QSO is a net, right? I mean, you're using the radio to communicate, and that's really what it's all about. So, and do you like my little cartoon people here?
Lovely.
I thought you guys would appreciate those. I looked for a female, but apparently we didn't have any. So, much like ham radio. Anyway, yeah. So, I did find one, but it was not appropriate, and I decided not to include it.
Well,
But,
you don't know though if they are not identifying you.
that's, I'm not even going to go there. Dan comments, I don't know if they're identifying as a woman or not, and I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot microphone. I'm not going to touch that with a 10-meter antenna. Let's put it that way, right? So, okay. So, there's a couple of different kinds of nets. We have our scheduled nets, and we have what I like to call an ad hoc net or an unscheduled net. So, a scheduled net is one that takes place at a regular time on a regular schedule. An example would be our Sunday evening net. We do that every week on the Ensign Peak repeater. An ad hoc net is more spontaneous. That's when you have operators talking to each other on the radio. So if you're listening and you hear, like 3 or 4 people talking on like the 6.2 or something like that, it's probably not a net. It's probably just some operators having a conversation. Well, it is a net, really. It's an ad hoc net, right? We're going to concentrate mainly on scheduled nets for this presentation. All right, so you may have a directed net or an undirected net. So the difference here is a directed net has a net control operator, an operator who is responsible for managing the net. And the net control operator gets to decide who talks and when. They don't necessarily decide what people are going to talk about. That's a key thing to think about. They are strictly responsible for managing the communications, not what gets communicated. So they manage the frequency, they set the order of the conversation, they make sure everybody gets a chance to say their bit, right? So an example of an undirected net would be something like a discussion or a roundtable where people pass the frequency to one another. There's no one station that's in charge. So, for example, it could be something where stations are just communicating amongst themselves. A directed net would be, you think about that instead of a circle, think about it operating in a star pattern where the net control is in the middle and he's talking to each point of the star and giving each point of the star an opportunity to have their bit, right? So if you visualize it that way, then you can kind of see how that works. So this would be an example of an undirected net. So here's a simple QSO with KD7ZWV, some guy that we all know and love very much and appreciate all the things that he does. And also N7XDL, who we also know and love very much and appreciate the things that he does. And they're having a conversation. So they're passing communications back and forth to each other.
You notice I have to go through the underground.
Well, I could have put another arrowhead on that, but I thought it made more sense this way. Now, if we add a third station, like our friend Paul, who we all know and love and appreciate very much, then we're going to pass it in this kind of circular fashion. And if we even added a 4th station, like N7LCR, our very dear friend Ragnar, who we love very much and appreciate all that he does for amateur radio as well, you would do this in kind of this circular fashion, right? That's an undirected net. No one station is in charge. Now,
it has to be clockwise too.
Sure, why not? So in a directed net, like our Sunday evening net, we have a net control station who we affectionately call N7MRY, which is the call sign of the Amateur Radio Club, Murray Amateur Radio Club. that we all know and love and appreciate very much. And they would operate as the center of this star. And so each station that's responding, and I have several people out here, not to pick on anyone, but I put several call signs that I hear on the net out on this slide. So but yeah, so obviously the net control is in charge and they're controlling who gets to speak and when they get to speak. All right. So let's talk about the parts of a net. So typically in your scheduled directed net, you're going to have sections of what happens. You're going to divide it up into pieces basically. And so the first thing you're going to do is have a preamble. The preamble is going to introduce the net, explain what it's for and what you're going to be talking about. And normally you're thinking, well, if I know I'm joining this net, I probably already know what it's about, right? Or I wouldn't be joining it. But remember, there may be other operators out there listening who don't know anything about your net or what it's for. And if they hear that preamble, then they might be encouraged to join in. Paul.
There may be nets, and I think of some especially non-ham radio nets that we do in our neighborhoods, where you don't want to explain all that stuff. If the net is seeking additional check-ins and public participation, yes, but sometimes you want to maybe play with it.
Paul points out that some nets may not want to have a preamble. They may not want to explain what they're all about. They may be assigned a specific purpose and only want the people who are currently involved in them to be part of it. And in that case, they would not necessarily have a long preamble that explains what they're all about, which makes perfect sense for some types of net. Typically, the next thing you're going to have is a roll call, and we'll talk more about roll calls in a bit. But that's just basically keeping track of who's present, who's actually participating in the net. Then you'll typically have a traffic portion of the net where any members of the net who had something they wanted to say to other members of the net have their chance to have their say. You might have some additional messages, maybe training or a message of the day or something like that. And you don't necessarily have to do these in this order, right? This order is flexible. When you're doing a net or you're planning a net, you can switch this around a little bit. You might put your training even before the roll call if you felt like that was necessary.
And if you want a short net, then you put the closing before the preamble.
Right. Or like Utah VHF Society, you can do the swap meet part first and then check out before the hour and a half long vote.
Okay. I'm not going to repeat those comments. And then finally you'll have the closing, which you end the net, you return the frequency to normal use, right? And it's always a good idea to have that closing and just say, hey, we're done. So anybody who was standing by and waiting to use the frequency knows that you're finished and they can actively use the frequency at that point.
So Dan, that's probably more important for what Paul was talking about, right? Like with repeaters, we hope that the clubs are coordinating more on repeater use. But on simplex use, there's no centralized way or group that you could coordinate it. So when we're talking about like, you know, these nets that have a very specific purpose where you may not be seeking additional members to join it, you do want to let anyone else who may have been listening to you, let you know that you're done, right? I'm releasing this frequency back to whoever wants to play.
Yeah, I mean, so Dan points out that, you know, this may be even the most important part of a net like Paul was talking about, where it's dedicated to a specific group, and that is to specifically release the frequency. One of the things to keep in mind, nobody owns a frequency, right? So even if you're coordinated with a group and you always have your net at 8 o'clock on a particular frequency, if someone is already using the frequency when you get there, you can ask them to move, but they don't necessarily have to. And this happens on HF with some regularity, unfortunately.
Once the net begins, however, the FCC does recognize that you have a right to stay there until the net's done.
So Paul points out that the FCC recognizes that once you have started your net, you have a right to continue it until you're done. So if you do run into a problem where you're in the middle of a net and somebody starts blasting in and says, hey, we're going to use this frequency now, and we don't care that you guys are here, we're going to talk, you know, they're actually breaking the rules. So that's good to know.
In which case you resolve it in the most amicable manner possible.
Of course, Jeff says, of course, you resolve this in the most amicable way possible. Yeah, sure you do. What was that? Lightsabers at 10 paces? Is that what I heard?
Fox and bolt cutters.
Oh, yeah, fox hunt and bolt cutters, yes. No, it's, it's always a good thing to be aware that the frequency, the spectrum is a limited resource, right? And it's limited, but at the same time, if you're on an HF net or you're on an HF frequency and someone comes to you and says, hey, we were going to have a net here, is that okay? And you say, yeah, sure, we'll move up 20 kilohertz or whatever. And you move up 20 kilohertz and let them have the frequency. That's the nice way to do it, right? That's you maybe don't have to do that, but that is the amateur operator way to do it, right? Dan, you have a comment? Or are you just
A
waving,
question.
exercising your elbow?
No, this is a question. The Marine Amateur Radio Club's frequency, our repeater, 22396 for receive. The repeater is owned by Murray Fire, but we still don't own the frequency. So just because it's our repeater, or just because it is someone else's frequency on their repeater, they still don't own the frequency. And even though the frequency was allocated to the Marine Amateur Radio Club, we still don't own the frequency. I may be splitting hairs, but I just want to make a note that nobody owns the frequencies. It's an FCC thing, right? We own the equipment. We can control the equipment. We can say you can't use our equipment that is running this frequency, right? But we do not own the frequency.
Okay. So Dan points out that even on a coordinated frequency with a repeater assigned to it and things like that, the repeater owner does not own the frequency. We're using that frequency, but we don't have any possession of it necessarily, both in a legal and a physical sense, right? So, okay, let's move on to the preamble. So we'll talk a little bit more about the preamble part of the net. So what the preamble does is it basically lets anybody who might be listening to that frequency know that a net is starting. That's always a good thing to do. Tells the name and purpose of the net, gives any background info required, talks about any of the rules and procedures for the net. And so I have an example here where net control comes on and they say, calling all stations. This is the monthly MARC swap net. We don't have a swap net. Maybe we should, I don't know. But this was my example net. This net is for any stations with equipment to trade or in need of a particular piece of equipment. This net meets on the fourth Thursday at 6:30 p.m. on the Murray repeater at 223.96 megahertz with a tone of 103.5 hertz. Why do we always say the frequency that we're meeting on, that it's a repeater, and what the tone is?
In case people want to run.
Somebody who's just tuning past and happens to hear us might not know that it's a repeater or that there's a particular tone that they need to use, or even what the frequency was. If they had it on a scanner or something like that, they might not have heard, or might not realize what frequency it was. And if they do want to hop in and join, that's good information for them to have. I can see Paul itching to say something.
No, I think giving the offset of the tone is a little silly. I would make the price of entry to the net at least being able to look it up.
The offset is a little silly. I agree. But the tone I don't think is necessarily silly. I mean, yes, you could probably detect the tone, but I'm not gonna, if I'm like driving in my car, I'm not gonna pull over and look at the repeater book to try to figure out what the tone is for this particular repeater.
I hope you're not gonna try to change it in your radio either.
While I'm driving? No, I'm not gonna do that, right? Dave.
One thing I noticed with some of the city nets, that's, other city nets, is that they'll have the first for, that particular day of the week on the repeater, the fifth. The fifth week, whether it does have a fifth week out of the month, it will be on a simplex.
So I have heard like Crossroads does that. They have a couple of different repeaters that they use. And so like on the odd weeks, they use one repeater. And on the even weeks, they use a different repeater. And on months where there's a fifth week, they use a simplex frequency. And, we kind of do something similar to that with our pre-meeting check-in nets that we do. And so we have a set of 4 or 3 different frequencies that we use for those. And it's just basically to make sure, yes, I can actually operate on all of these different repeaters or all these different frequencies. And I actually know how to program my radio to do that. And I actually understand how it works well enough to be able to do that. And so that's kind of we do that kind of to prove to ourselves that, yes, I know what I'm doing. I know how to turn my radio on and set it to the right frequency also. There have been a number of times when I have keyed up and said something in response to a prompt from net control and then realized I was talking on the wrong repeater because my radio has 2 VFOs and I was on the second VFO instead of the first VFO or vice versa. And so,
So when 6.2 comes back, Jan,
what are you talking about? Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like, so yeah, I mean, when I say, yes, we know how to set up our radios, it actually is good to make sure you actually know how to do it.
And that can be valuable if you're in a group where people don't generally check into any other nest of yours. Because you can get rusty and forget how to even go to it.
Paul points out that if you have a particular group that your net is the only one that they ever check into, they can easily forget how to program their radio or how to set it into VFO mode or something like that and punch in the frequency. And so reminding people how to do that periodically is never a bad idea. Dan.
Just a case in point, I have a radio in my office and all the nets that I am involved with, I never have a station that is programmed into my radio. I always use the VFO and I always manually program it for that very reason, because I want to do it quickly, and I can do it quickly, just at a drop of a hat, just because of that. So I'm not relying on the frequencies.
Yeah, so Dan points out that he has a radio that he uses for nets that he doesn't actually use the memory frequencies on it. He always programs it manually, both the frequency and tone accordingly for the net that he's connecting into, mainly so that he remembers how to do that and gets comfortable with programming the radio. Now, if you've got 6 different radios, you're probably only going to do that with one of them that you want to get really comfortable with. And you probably should do that with the radio you use the most. But I'm not saying go out and delete all your memories out of your radio, because that would be silly. But it never hurts to go through that exercise periodically and make sure you actually do remember how to punch in a frequency manually, how to set a CTCSS tone manually on the radio. So it's always a good idea.
There's also, this Taylorsville, they use 2 different repeaters. They're up in the same place at punching. And like a few weeks ago, they couldn't get in on 2 meter, and the 440 worked great. So it was kind of nice to be able to use that. So it's good to use. I try to use both of them. One quick back.
Yeah. Ragnar points out that Taylorsville uses 2 different frequencies for their nets. And recently they had an instance where one of their repeaters wasn't working, or they were not able to have it on the net on the frequency that they were expecting to, but they were able to switch to the other one as a backup and were able to still have their net. So that's Oh, they're linked, so,
There's something else that's come up too that, regarding frequency, that's come up in Draper. Draper's version of standard load has the repeater, and the repeater's frequency is simplex on adjacent channels to the standard load.
I've seen that.
And I wonder if, that is the reason why sometimes people are trying to check into the net on repeater output instead of.
Quite possibly. And I know they do that on purpose. So Paul points out that Draper, they actually have two frequencies in their standard load, one of which is their repeater and one of which is the repeater output frequency as a simplex frequency. And I know why they do that. They do that because if the repeater breaks and fails, then everybody is still using the same frequency and they're just using it in simplex. But it does potentially cause problems where you do have people checking into the net and people distant can't hear them because they're actually talking on the repeater output. They're on that simplex frequency, not on the repeater frequency. So
You might even want to say in your preamble, the frequency standard load channel blank.
yeah,
Just
yeah. So the comment is to, when you're giving your frequency, it doesn't hurt to say like, hey, if you're using the standard load, it's channel 26 or whatever it is, right? So, okay, let's move on to the roll call. So the purpose of the roll call is to identify the operators participating in the net. Now, there's a few different ways to do these roll calls, and a lot of them, it depends on how big the group is or how big the list of people who regularly check in is. So quite often regular members are called directly, right? Where you may actually walk through a list and say, like we do in our Sunday net, you call out each operator in turn and wait for them to respond. And if they don't respond, you move on to the next one. I've also heard like the Crossroads group, when they do their net, they'll call out and say, stations northwest of Salt Lake City Center, respond now. And people will call in individually that are in that area. And then they'll call southwest, and then they'll call northeast, and then they'll call southeast, and then they'll call anybody outside of Salt Lake City proper, right? So you can do that by grouping. I've heard on IRLP, what do they call those? The groups on IRLP, reflectors.
Yeah.
On IRLP reflector, I've heard there's a super large group, and they do it by region, right? So they'll say, I want stations in region 1. So anybody with a call sign that has a 1 in it comes back at that point. And they'll say sometimes like 2 at a time or 3 at a time. And so 2 people will check in and they'll get acknowledged by net control. And then the next 2 will check in and they'll get acknowledged and so on. The problems with that can be, you might get doubling, right? That's really the only problem that shows up there. And how do you solve that problem? Well, net control comes back and says they acknowledge each station that they heard. So if they didn't hear you, try again, right? So if you tried to respond to a roll call in that fashion and they didn't hear you, then wait until the next group and try again. Go ahead, Paul.
You know, something that drives me nuts on the VHS citing net sometimes is when net controls will say, there was a double, come again and try to space them out.
But they don't say which one, right? Yeah, so yeah, Paul says, like there'll be a double, right? And net control will say, try again and double again, double or nothing, right? So
And it's important if you are the net control station to try to pick out something that you can identify.
some identifying factor, right?
Station ending in J.
Yeah, if you heard like only part of one of the calls, say, like Paul says, the station ending with J come first, and then the other station, right? And that way, the people who doubled have some idea what they're doing, because otherwise they're both sitting there looking at the microphone like, do I try to go first or do I wait for the other guy? And then, 3 minutes goes by and nobody has said anything, right? And obviously not 3 minutes, but yeah, that can be a problem when you're doing that kind of thing. So if you are the net control and you're taking a roll call like that, and you do get a double, try to identify something. If you recognize one of the station's voices a little bit, say, I think that was so-and-so, go ahead and come back if that was you. And then after they come back, then you can acknowledge them and say, and the other station that doubled with you, go ahead and come now. And then, they can do their thing. So we generally don't have much trouble with that, except in the visitor portion of our net, which is kind of free form, right? So we do try to acknowledge each station as they call in as visitors. So usually you'll have the regular members and you'll have visitors. Those are people who aren't normally part of the net. They want to participate as well, or at least let you know that they're there, which is great. You typically do that after the regular members. Some nets will intersperse it in the middle. For example, that Crossroads, I think that if they're doing northwest corner, they'll take regular stations and visitors from the northwest corner, right? And so on around. But yeah, we do have that happen sometimes where two stations will double. And if you're the net control when that happens, if you can pick out some identifying factor, that it doesn't have to be much, even like Paul says, if it's the last letter of their call sign, that might be enough to distinguish the two stations and allow you to call one out in particular and have them go first. But just saying, hey, try again, that's not necessarily a winning strategy, right?
And a great way to practice that is doing contesting like field day. You are constantly doing that, right? Last station, XL, come back.
Yeah, so Dan points out in contesting, if you can participate in some contesting, you'll get experience doing that. You'll hear a lot of doubling and you'll be able to get practice at doing that. And you'll also hear how, even if you're just monitoring the contest, you'll hear how operators who are dealing with a pileup handle that. And you can learn by listening to what the other operators are doing, right? So it never hurts to listen and learn by listening. So another thing that you'll hear sometimes is they'll call for missed check-ins. Sometimes people will miss their call. They won't have joined the net early enough. You'll often call for missed check-ins at the end of the roll call, and quite often you'll even call for them at the end of the net, at the very end of the net. And then any stations who didn't get a chance to check in during the roll call time will have an opportunity to check in. Okay. So when you're checking someone in, each person checking in gives their name, their call sign, and if they have any traffic for the net. Sometimes there will be other things, right? They're the handshakers net, for example, they'll have a question of the day. And so they'll say, at the beginning of the roll call, the question of the day is, what did you have for breakfast this morning? And so everybody will say when they check in, oh, this is KD7ZWV Jan, I had eggs and bacon, and so on, right? And it's not traffic, it's just a little token. Crossroads, when they check in, they give the name of their closest elementary school. So whatever school you live near, you'll say the name of the elementary school when you check into Crossroads net. So, but you typically don't do traffic during the roll call. So, the question is that traffic or is that not traffic? It's kind of a gray area. And again, the net itself can make a policy on how they want to handle that, right? A lot of times if your net covers a wide area, people will give their location when they check in. And we have, since we're the Murray Club, but we have members from outside of Murray, like Paul and Ragnar from West Valley City, they'll even say, hey, Paul, AE4KR, West Valley City. Or we have some guys in Sandy and Riverton that routinely check in. We have guys that have checked in from Mill Creek and up in Salt Lake that semi-routinely check into our net, and they'll say where they're calling in from. Generally, when you're the Murray Amateur Radio Club net, you don't have to say you're calling in from Murray if you're calling in from Murray, but you certainly can. We're not going to, slap your fingers off the mic if you do that. So, but yeah, so those are kinds of things that happen during the roll call. So I have an example. I don't know. Does somebody want to play net control and I'll be KD7ZWV? Or do you want me to do both sides?
Change your voice.
This is net control, KD7ZWV Jan. Are you out there? Yeah, this is Kilo Delta 7 Zulu Whiskey Victor. Jan, I have no traffic. So that's
Doesn't sound that good.
thanks, Ragnar. Appreciate that. So that's one example. So here's another one, stations from Salt Lake County, come now. So I'm gonna call in, hey, I'm KD7 ZWV, Jan and Murray, I have no traffic. You might have stations in Region 7, 2 at a time, call now. So I'll come back with, hey, this is Kilo Delta 7, Zulu Whiskey Victor, Jan in Utah. My favorite band is the B-52s. It's not necessarily the B-52s. I have lots of favorite bands, but I like the B-52s. And then Dan might come back with, this is November 7, X-Ray Delta Lima, Dan also in Utah, and my favorite band is, and I just picked Oingo Boingo out of a hat. I don't know if that's your favorite band or not, but
Possible group of.
but I thought you would love that if I picked Oingo Boingo. So I picked it specifically for you, Dan.
Thank you.
And so then Net Control comes back with, I copied Jan and Dan from Utah. Are you sure it wasn't Jan and Dean, or are you guys in the Beach Boys? What's going on? Next 2 stations, right? So so that's kind of an example of,
I did security for the Beach Boys.
Did you? yeah, well, that's always good to know.
Much
Okay.
more.
So, so moving on to the traffic portion of our net. So traffic is any kind of information a station has for the net. So maybe there's an upcoming event, maybe there's some information about a recent experience that you had. Maybe you have a request for information about a particular topic. You might have in a swap net, you might have offers or requests for specific equipment. Also, if you want to like borrow a piece of equipment from the club or some member of the club and you don't necessarily know who has it, that would be valid traffic to come back with on the net. Hey, I have traffic. And when it gets to your traffic section of the net, you'll say, yes, my traffic is, I'm looking for a watt meter that I can borrow for a couple of weeks or borrow for a day while I'm doing an installation. And if somebody has one, then they can come back and respond. Net Control is responsible for making sure that somebody has a chance to respond to those questions as well, right? So as that traffic portion is going on, sometimes you'll hear like in a recent net, somebody, I don't remember who it was, but was talking about a particular event. And then the Net Control asked, does anybody have any questions about that? And anybody with questions could come back and say their call sign and I have a question. And then when they're recognized by Net Control, then they can come back with their question. And then the original station would be able to answer that question, hopefully. But yeah, basically, the traffic portion is allowing messaging to move around the net, allowing members of the net to communicate the topics that they wanted to cover, right? So pretty straightforward. Here's an example. Let's go to Paul for his traffic, A4KR, go ahead. And Paul says, thanks and good evening, everyone. I'd like to remind everyone about the 10-meter net coming up on Wednesday at 2000 hours. Mountain Daylight Time, that's 8 p.m. local on 28.345 upper sideband. Technicians can check in on this net. So if you've got the equipment, please join us. Net Control says, thanks, Paul. Does anyone have any questions about the 10-meter net? Silence is heard.
That's free.
I based it off of an actual net. I did base it off of an actual net. So yeah, and then Net Control comes back with nothing heard. We'll move on to the next person with traffic, right? And so on.
Thanks for your
So
service.
I looked it up specifically for this presentation because I wanted to get it correct and the time and date of the net. So I didn't know Paul was going to be here, but I was picking on Paul because he always has something to say about the 10-meter net, which one of these days I'm going to check in on that net. So I will surprise you when that happens. Okay, additional messaging. Typically after the traffic portion of the net, any additional information can be given. Some nets may have training. Some nets may assign a particular person to give training. Some may give a general message of interest to all. Others may just move on and close the net, right? So for example, Net Control says, and now we have Ragnar and 7LCR with an interesting astronomical fact. Ragnar is always the repository of astronomical facts. If you had no idea, now you know. And Ragnar would come back with, okay, I just wanted to let everyone know the moon tonight is called a blue moon. And that's when you have 2 full moons in the same month. I don't know why it's blue. It still looks white to me, but that's what they call it.
You could have quoted me.
And 7LCR back to Net Control, right? So I put a lot of effort into this, you guys. So, you know, I tried to be as accurate as I could. All right. I've been on our net for a while, so yes, and I've heard an awful lot of nets. So then the closing portion of the net, very straightforward. You close the net, you give thanks to any operators who participated in the net and return the net or return the frequency to normal amateur radio use. Some nets may make a final call for visitors or missed check-ins or late check-ins before they close. For example, well, that does it for tonight. Thanks everyone for participating. It was fun. This has been the XYZ Happy Hour Net, and we're now returning this frequency to normal amateur radio use. This is KD7ZWV, 73 to all. Have a good evening. I'll be standing by for a while after the net. And that's how you end the net. So, yes, sir.
What if somebody said, recheck? What do you do?
Recheck. Okay. So if you're the net control and you pause for a moment and somebody says recheck, that means they have something new that they wanted to say that they didn't know they wanted to say during the roll call. So you recognize them and say, go ahead, recheck, and then they can come back with whatever their comment was. And that can happen sometimes, anytime during the net, right? Another thing that might happen is someone might have an emergency and need to use the frequency for an emergency. And normally in your preamble, you'll say something like, hey, if anyone has an emergency, say break, and we'll hand the frequency over to you. And so if you're net control and you hear somebody say break, that is an indicator to you that someone might have some seriously important traffic. You should stop whatever you're doing and ask them, go ahead, break. What's your traffic? What do you got? And if they have an emergency, deal with it. You've got 20, 30 operators on the radio right there. Hopefully someone also has a phone with them. So if they, I've heard of situations where somebody drove into a river or something and an amateur radio operator happened to be in the area and was able to call in to somebody on the air. Well, how do you know someone's on the air? Well, if you hear a net in progress, you're pretty sure somebody's on the frequency, right? So you got a pretty good chance of getting through. So if you do have a situation like that and you're the first one on the scene and you need to get help and you don't have cell phone coverage where you're at for whatever reason, go ahead and break in on that net. They'll stop for you. Say break or break, or whatever you need to say to get their attention and tell them, hey, I've got emergency traffic. This is KD7ZWV. I've got emergency traffic. And then they will deal with that and they'll help you out. Amateur radio operators are pretty good about helping people out.
Well, one of the best examples of that is doing a public service event. Those are all nets. Go on for hours, but they're still nets.
Yeah, Paul points out the public service events are nets in this fashion, and they're specifically geared for handling emergency or pseudo emergency traffic, right? So you may go 20 minutes with nobody saying anything on the radio, but the net is still in progress, right? We're going to talk about emergency communications nets next week, and we'll probably talk about some event net stuff as well. So if you're interested in that, come next week. But yeah, this one is more like what our Sunday evening net is like. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, so not just letting the repeater reset and letting people break in, but also making sure that your own radio resets. So we joined a Sunday night net on Simplex, and I guess it was 2 weeks ago, we had the net control. He was using either a new radio or hadn't configured his timeout times. It was on 30 seconds or 60 seconds, and we had a lengthy preamble. His
radio was timing out
transmission
after
cut
30 seconds.
Yeah, and he didn't realize it. He wasn't sure. He didn't know, whatever. So it's important to know your gear and know what beeps or lack of beeps your radio makes, because some of them just go dead.
Yeah.
Actually letting you know
That's
the timeout time.
That's true. So Dan points out, in as talking on these caveats, gotchas, and things to know, I mentioned leaving breaks or pauses between transmissions. So you want to leave a spot for somebody to check in, somebody to break in if they do have an emergency. And that means you need to pause your talking as the net control every once in a while. Leave a second or two or three or five between things that you're saying. So if you're like in the middle of the preamble of your thing and it's a long preamble, it doesn't hurt to stop after every paragraph and unkey for a second or two. And that way, if somebody does need to break in, they have the opportunity. Dan pointed out that your timeout timer and the repeater's timeout timer might not be set the same. So most repeaters have a 3-minute timeout on them, right? So if you are keyed up and talking on the repeater for 3 minutes, the repeater will stop listening after 3 minutes. Most radios are also configured that way, but Dan brought out a time when somebody on their simplex net in their neighborhood had new equipment that they didn't realize was set to a 30-second timeout. And they were reading through the preamble and their radio cut out after 30 seconds. And they continued to read the script into the dead microphone for however long that took. And presumably their particular radio didn't go back to receive mode when that happened, as long as the PTT was still pressed in. So they never knew that that was happening, right? So yeah, so that can be an issue. So that's a reason why you want to pause periodically, unkey, and also why you need to be familiar with your equipment and understand how your equipment is configured, so that you don't set your timeout timer to 30 seconds without realizing it. So let's see, I covered leaving pauses and breaks, allow the repeater to reset. During roll call, make sure you give the other station time to respond. Yeah, KD7WV, Jan, are you there? Moving on, N7XDL, Dan, are you there? Moving on, KC7, now you want to give them a few seconds to respond. They may have the radio sitting there and they're listening and they're not realizing that it's coming up to their spot. And all of a sudden they hear their call sign and they're like, wait, where's the microphone? And that might take them a couple of seconds to get to it. Give them a chance to respond. I've heard some people doing a roll call go really fast, and that's a recipe for missed and late check-ins. So just be aware of that fact, right? During the roll call, listen for doubles. Acknowledge stations that check in so that someone who doubled or was doubled on knows that they weren't received. We talked about that before. Don't forget to ID every 10 minutes. Remember, the law says you have to ID every 10 minutes and at the end of your set or end of your conversation, end of your time on the radio, right? So if you're IDing with an event or club call sign, you need to ID with that every 10 minutes. And if you're doing that, you still need to use your own call sign at least once an hour. Now, our net never runs for a full hour, but that is something to be aware of if you're on a net that does run a long time. Jeff,
Only once an hour?
if you're using an event call sign or a club call sign, you still have to ID with the club call sign or event call sign once every 10 minutes. But you do still have to identify with your call sign at least once an hour. Does that make sense? So typically when we do our Sunday net, we've been doing it as N7MRY, which is our club call sign. And so the person doing the net is identifying throughout the net with the club call sign N7MRY. Now, you're going to ID with your call sign probably at the very end, which is typically within that hour period. But if our net happened to run over an hour, you'd have to do it at least once an hour, give your actual call sign. And that's something that, people sometimes forget to ID. And that's another thing that I have on here. Allow other stations to ID if they forget. And sometimes that'll happen during the traffic portion, right? I'll hand it off to Dan and he'll say his bit and someone will come on and say, ha ha, Dan, very funny. And they didn't ID. Now, I probably recognize their voice because I've heard them before, but I want to give them a chance to ID. And if they don't, I'm going to say, hey, don't forget to ID, right? Because they need to do ID within every 10 minutes of their talking, or at the end of their conversation, right?
And if they've just done it, they still have to do it on what.
At the end of their last transmission, exactly, right? So, or during their last transmission. So that is something you need to think about as net control. Make sure you give them a chance to ID, Dan.
Now, Mickey did this, and I'm not sure. I've tried to look for the agency rules on this, where Mickey would say, okay, everybody ID. And so everybody IDs at the same time, and to me, that's.
It's
The
legal.
rule doesn't say someone has to understand your.
Yeah,
ID.
they don't have to hear you, right?
We have doubling, quadrupling, actually 30 people ID
Right.
at the same time, so, why not?
I don't like that. It's legal, let's put it this way,
Yeah,
it's perfectly legal, because no, the rule is that your transmitter has to ID itself, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that someone has to be able to hear you or understand what you said, as long as you are satisfying the rule by IDing. But what I don't like is, hey, for ID, it's KD7ZWB. Everybody knows it's for ID, right?
That's pet peeve of
Yeah,
mine, too.
you don't have to say it's for ID. And I hear that sometimes. I'll hear like someone will just be in the middle of a conversation and then they'll just say, oh yeah, whatever their call sign is for ID. Okay, we know it's for ID. You don't have to actually say that. And I'm not gonna like tell them off on the radio, oh, you don't have to say that, but it is a pet peeve of mine to hear people do that. And I say that full well having done that before myself, right? We used to do a Raytheon net every Tuesday at like 1:30 in the afternoon. We had two buildings that were part of our company. One was at Knutson's Corner over here, and one was in American Fork. And so we used to do a net every week from ham radio operators who were at each end, right? So we usually had maybe 3 or 4 at each building. And we would do that. We'd get to some point and then we'd all say, this is KD7ZWB for ID. And then the next guy would say, blah, blah, blah for ID, blah, blah, blah for ID, and so on, right? And everybody would say that. And then we'd continue with our conversation. This was one of those ad hoc type nets, right? It was not a directed net, or, it wasn't it was scheduled, but it wasn't a directed net. But yeah, somebody did make that comment to me that, you don't actually have to say that. And I realized it's really kind of silly. I should just say my call sign periodically, right? And I know, like Gordon Smith, he was awesome, because if he was in a roundtable discussion on the 6.2, he would always, when he keyed up, say his call sign first, K7HFB, and that satisfies the requirement, right? So even if it's more than 10 minutes before it gets back to him, he said it during that transmission. And that's what you need to do, right? So, but he was always, his melodious voice was just always a pleasure to hear on the 6.2, and he would always do that. And then even at the end of what he was saying, he would hand it off to the next person by call sign, typically if he remembered who they were, and he would say from K7HFB, right? So always a good habit to get into, to just drop your call sign into the conversation.
And if you listen to the Salt Lake County Aries net next week on net control, I'm going to announce my call sign in CW.
Okay.
Because the rule is either CW or in English.
So Dan, on the next Aries net, Dan's going to announce his call sign in CW because he can.
Because I can.
And that's kind of cool too. So yeah, the rule is to either say it.
No, I'm using a recorder on the computer. Just to do it.
Okay.
Which kind of goes against, you're not supposed to play music.
CW is an exception. It may sound like music, but it's music to our ears, but it's not music by definition.
This isn't a very weird thing to do either, like on large conference calls, you end up doing this, right? Especially where you have just a phone bridge, so you can't see attendees, and you have groups of people who have perhaps never met each other, or maybe I've just been on a lot of boring conference calls before. But you end up starting every comment that you say with, well, this is Dan from such and such company or such and such group or such and such team, and here's my comment, whatever, because not everyone will recognize your voice. So it's a good habit to get into, especially if you end up on a lot of conference calls with strangers. Send them a shout out now. It's very.
Dan and Murray shutting up now, right now. So Dan points out that this happens even on conference bridges. I'm gonna repeat it because the recording needs to, maybe didn't hear you very well. So he says that does happen where people will say their name before they make their comment on a large conference call or conference bridge. It's not a bad habit to be in for that type of situation. All right. Other caveats, gotchas, and things to know. If there is a script for the net, read through it before you start doing the net. Okay? You want to have read it at least once before you try to read it aloud on the air. Same with parade instructions, right? No, so familiarize yourself. There may be unusual terminology that you're not familiar with. There may be weird phrasing that you're not familiar with. Get familiar with it before you start the net, right? So if you're the new net control for this Sunday and you've never read through the script before, read through the script. It helps you to realize, oh, I'm going to be saying that. Well, that doesn't make any sense, right? And if you do encounter something like that in the script and you need to make a change, it's not a bad idea to get back to the person who wrote the script and say, by the way, you did this wrong and you should fix it. Brad messaged me after this last Sunday's net and said, by the way, in the script, you say I'm the secretary. I'm not the secretary anymore. Please don't do that. And so I need to fix the script so that the script generator, so that it doesn't use his name and call sign in vain.
Anything else? When you go to do the net, bring a straight edge. Because no matter how carefully it's laid out, do this.
Yes.
And this, and then where you can get lost.
Paul points out if you have something you can use to delineate what line you're on in the script, that can be extremely handy as you're reading it, because it's very easy to get to the end of the line and think, oh, where the heck was I? What part of the paragraph was I in? Nah, I'm right here, and then continue on. You don't want to do that. You want to be keeping track or squeezing the PTT button, right? Yeah, so keep track of that. During roll call, keep track of the stations that check in. Write them down. You should be maintaining a log where you can write them down. Gary, did you have a question, or are you just
Oh, you just answered
signaling?
what I was gonna ask.
Oh, okay.
You must bring my mind.
So it's also a good idea to jot down next to them on the roll call if they have traffic or not. I did a net one time. I was doing our Sunday evening net. I blew past the traffic portion and closed the net without even thinking about it. And, 2 hours later, I realized that Dan had traffic for that net, and I just skipped him entirely and closed the net after the roll call. So keep track of that, write it down as you're going through so that you have something to refer to and you can look at it, right? When you're asking your visitors, remind them to give you their call sign slowly. If they just sang it out really fast, ask them, hey, can you give me your call sign slower so that I can copy it down? And they'll come back again and do it again. And they don't have a problem with that. But, you have to remind them of that, right? Have them give it to you slowly. If you didn't get it, ask for it again. If you still didn't get it, ask for it again, as many times as necessary so that you actually have a record, right?
Yeah.
Gary, you got a funny look on your face.
Question about the roll call. Is there such a thing as a formal roll sheet that we can pass on from one control operator to the next? Keep record of who responds?
So Jeff has that information in a spreadsheet, and he sends that to whoever's going to do the net that week. So we've been talking about ways to get that into the script so that the roll call is actually in the script document. And we've been talking about a lot of different things. So there may be enhancements to our net at some point where we automate some things. If you're not handy with automation, that may not be good for you. But Yeah, so that's something to consider.
I would look to be dangerous.
But yeah, whoever's doing the net, you should get a copy of the roll call, the current roll call from Jeff. Because not everybody who's a member of the club checks in on the net every week. And so we don't necessarily keep people in the roll call if they never check in. Right? And it's, normal practice for us to say, to email somebody, hey, I haven't heard you on the net in 3 weeks. Do you still want to be on the roll call? And if they don't, take them off. If they do still want to be on, it's fine for us to call them, even if they're not there. But there's no real point to calling a bunch of people who aren't there every week, right? So some people, they can only come once a month. They can only hit the net once a month because they have other obligations or whatever. That's okay. And we try to take that into account.
Yeah.
Yes, Dan.
So part of being net control is also being able to copy NATO phonetics. And a large number of people can give their call in NATO phonetics a lot faster than they can copy. Right? I wager to bet that's in the 90% plus of us can say our call sign a lot faster than we can copy.
Oh, yeah, I could say Kilo Delta 7 Zulu Whiskey Victor really fast, right? Because I'm used to saying it, right? You're not necessarily used to writing it down, so that can be a factor. So Dan's point is, a lot of people can give their call sign with phonetics a lot faster than they can copy it from somebody giving it with phonetics. So, or NCW. So say it slow. Don't be in a hurry, right? When you're checking in on a net, you don't have to be in a hurry. You've got all the time in the world to say your bit, right? So take your time, say it, make sure they get it. If you're the net control, if you didn't get it, ask for it again, right? It's not a problem there. Nobody's going to get in your case because you didn't, because you asked them to repeat their call sign 6 times. They're going to try saying it super slow that 6th time, I'll bet. This is Kilo Delta. Yeah, right. So anyway, okay. Here's somebody mentioned recheck before. You may hear people use words like recheck and break. We talked about that before. Break means they have something urgent. You need to stop the net while you deal with their traffic. That's like an emergency. Handle that immediately. Provide any assistance that you can. Other people on the net will stand by, or they will provide assistance as well if they can, right? Recheck means someone already checked in. They need you to come back to them again. Either they thought of something they forgot, or they had a new idea that they wanted to mention that they hadn't told you about, right? So.
And my only question on the break is sometimes I break in by using break only because there's a pertinent, not because I'm an emergency, but I have something pertinent about that QSO that just went on, and I needed to say something before the other person transmits again. And
So much faster.
So
yeah,
Info is helpful.
So that's another, yeah,
or info, yeah.
as
maybe
Paul
I
points
should
out,
use
you
info.
can use a different word other than break. If you need to use, if they're not hearing you when you try to, so typically if you're in a conversation with somebody or you're hearing a QSO and you want to jump in there, you're going to say your call sign, right? They may not hear your call sign because they may be coming back and forth pretty fast. Break is really short. It's really fast to say. And so even if it's not an emergency, you can use break as a keyword, right? But keep in mind, if you do have an emergency, definitely use break. Don't be, this is, oh, you guys are not listening anymore. You're talking. So, you want to say it quickly. You want to jump in as quick as you can. If you do need to break into a net, jump in on the squelch tail. Get as close to that last transmission as you can get, right? Key up and say break right away, because you may not have a long time between, they may not be pausing like they're supposed to. You may not have a long time between transmissions to get your point in there and say, hey, listen to me. I have something to say.
And I tell you, during Utah SAG events where I'm dealing with the medical issue, I'm constantly saying break to get in there so other operators in other stations don't
Hear
talk
you.
about silly stuff, right?
Yeah.
And if the first time I call it in, I always use 3 breaks. Some people do 2, but I always do break. When I say break, that's
an emergency.
That's almost Mayday.
Yeah. Yeah. So don't abuse that. But yeah, if they're not hearing you try to break in, you can say break, even if it's not an emergency. It's urgent traffic, right? Maybe it's relevant to what was just said, and you need to get it in there because somebody said something that was wrong on the internet, and you're dealing with that because you must, right? No, sorry, not on the internet, on the radio, yeah. But no, I mean, if somebody gives something that's factually inaccurate, like they're giving medical advice and it's not factually accurate, that's something that may, if you know the actual truth, it wouldn't hurt to break in and say that,
Or if they said left turn instead of right, you know that one goes off the pier.
Yeah, right? Yeah, so that kind of thing.
Yes, so follow it.
All right. And so my last slide, remember, and Mark, we want every member of the club to have the opportunity to be net control for our Sunday evening net. So you may be asked to do this. You will be asked to do this. Don't worry about it. It's nothing to fear. Once you've done it a few times, you'll be completely comfortable doing it. And if you ever need to run a net in the future, you'll know what to do. And that's why we do it. That's why we have people do it that aren't necessarily comfortable with it. Because once you've done it, now you know how to do it. And next time you're asked to do it, it won't be scary, right? Dan.
And people who tell me that they are afraid to run the net, I always tell them, there's no reason to be afraid because you make the rules. Net control operators don't make any mistakes. When you're running the net, it's okay,
Dan points out, when you're the net control, you can't make mistakes because it's your net. You're in charge, you make the rules, and whatever you said is correct by definition. So, Jeff.
What's the best way to handle weak signals?
So Jeff asked about weak signals. So we have this happen sometimes where people will come in on the output and not realize that their radio isn't configured correctly, or they'll just have a really crappy signal and they won't be able to get into the repeater, and you'll hear squelch break, and so this happens like during roll call. You'll call somebody and you'll hear the squelch break, and you'll know that that's the station that's trying to respond to what you just called, but you can't hear what they're saying. You can ask for relay, but on a repeater, everybody heard the same thing you heard, right? So unless someone is physically close to where their transmitter is and they heard them on the input, and sometimes I'll do that. If I'm listening and I have a key on my mic to do the reverse so that I can hear the input. And sometimes if I hear something like that, I'll switch that on real fast to see if I can hear what they're trying to say. Quite often I hear nothing, right? Which makes perfect sense. Because if they're too far away for the repeater to hear them, what are the chances my radio is going to hear them? But I still will give it a shot sometimes. And if you do hear somebody and you can actually make out what they're saying on the input, you can come back and say, when they ask for a relay, you can come back and say, hey, I heard them on the input. It was so-and-so. Their radio must be misconfigured. They'll hear that too. And then they'll say, oh no, my radio's misconfigured. What do I do? Paul.
Sometimes I hear all you guys acknowledge somebody that I couldn't hear in West LA City, which tells me I'm the only one far enough away to know.
To not hear them, right?
They were on.
Yeah, exactly.
If you hear that happen, if you don't hear that person respond, but you hear net control acknowledge them, you might want to break in and say, just to know that person was on the output.
Yeah, and I've heard you say that before. I've heard you do that before, Paul, and appreciate that. Because yeah, otherwise the person doesn't know that their radio is misconfigured, right? So, that's a valid point, because Paul is kind of way out on the west side of the valley here. He's quite a ways away from us, and yeah, so
Elevation.
Except the
lack of elevation, negative elevation. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely a thing to consider. But yeah, so how do you handle weak signals? If you have a good idea who they were, you can check them in. It's no big deal. If you really couldn't tell who that was, say that. Hey, I couldn't make out what you were saying. I heard the squelch break, but you were so lost in the noise I couldn't hear you at all, or whatever. And then move on. Because if you're not going to hear them, chances are good you're not going to hear them, right? Now admittedly, they could be holding their radio like they do in Hollywood, where the antenna's pointed back behind them. And maybe if they straighten their radio up, you'd be able to hear them. But you don't know what they're doing. You don't know what's going on there. So you can't judge that from where you are. You can only do what, you hear what you hear, right? So you make the best effort that you can. And like I say, if you were calling a specific station during a roll call and you hear some noise like that, you can say, hey, that was probably Stan, but I couldn't make out what you were saying. So next club meeting, bring your radio in, let's double check the configuration and then move on, go to the next station, roll call, right? So does that make sense?
Sometimes it's just a matter of moving 3 feet in one direction.
That can happen.
Which direction?
That can happen.
A direction.
Paul has a little antenna that if he sets it on the floor in front of the door, it works great on the 6.2. But if it's not sitting there, not great. It works, but it's not great, right? And so I've talked to Paul on the radio sometimes late at night and have been like, oh, hey, Paul, are you out there? E4K, I'll call him and he'll come back and say, give me a minute to set my antenna up. And I know what he's doing. He's moving his antenna over in front of the door so that I can actually hear him well.
Well, and also getting away from computer stuff, like once in.
Yeah, so, but that all those things go together, and radio, it's kind of fuzzy and wrinkly and has a lot of weird edges and stuff. And so sometimes you can be in a particular place. Like for example, I was on my mobile at the Apollo Burger on Redwood Road and 78th South, and nobody could hear me. All they could hear was noise. But as soon as I got away from there, everybody could hear me just fine. It's just one of those things, right? So, you don't know, there's multipathing that happens, radio waves get lost in the atmosphere. Who knows what happens, right? Some guy on the moon is listening to you and he doesn't know what to do with you, right? So, but yeah, I mean, we give our best effort when we have something like that happen. We give our best effort and try to do what we can. So
That's why it's called amateur radio.
it's amateur radio. Nobody's paying us to do this. Yeah, nobody's paying us to do this. We're just doing this because it's kind of cool, right? So, well, at least we think it's kind of cool. Other people may have different opinions, but that's neither here nor there. As long as we think it's cool and we're the ones doing it, that's all that really matters. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up. We're like a half an hour late, so I'm gonna stop the recording.